Five, four, three, two, one. I want to say welcome to the legendary Milton Allimadi here again. I Never Knew TV. What's going on?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for this honored studio,
we
Pan African studio.
we are glad to have you up here, right? How do you think Trump policies moving forward will impact Black people in America?
Oh, that's really a sad one because obviously this is the representative of unchecked capital, right? We have the example in Africa. There's no way we can withstand unchecked capital in Africa. That's essentially what's happening in Africa. Africans don't have the capital. They can't industrialize without the capital. So they're dependent on the outside world, and the outside world make all these conditions and take advantage of the continent. The same thing in this country. In this country, even forget Trump. Before I get back to Trump, Trump is just a symptom of what has been going on. He's just an individual. No individual can have that much power, right? He is not even one of the wealthiest in this country, right? But collectively, the so-called 1% essentially control all the wealth in this country. There's no more middle class in this country. I know a very wealthy person, and this is what he told me. He told me this maybe about 10 years ago. He's a billionaire. And he initiated this conversation, meaning it's something that he's been thinking about. He said, Milton, I think in this country, there'll be social upheavals, sustained, and possibly even a revolution. I think, why is this wealthy guy talking like this? I said, why do you say that? He said, because when I started making my money in the 1980s, there was a middle class in this country. Most people get a decent job. Once you have a decent job, you send your kids to school, have a saving, pay off your home, and retire, and you have money.
What do you call it? Social safety net?
Absolutely.
Term?
Just think about that.
Yeah.
And he said, now people need 2-3 jobs just to survive. He said, now there's only me, talking about himself, and everybody else, which I guess includes me. And he said, you cannot sustain a country like that. You just can't. You can't cut all social spending. You can't stop investing in education, in infrastructure. All you do is tax cuts for the wealthy, right? So that nobody even talks about trickle down. That's nonsense. Everything is flowing up, right? And that's what he told me. So why? And he said one other thing. He said they think they can use the armed forces to contain the lid, but it's not going to work. So there's going to be a time where it happens multiple locations at the same time. And then what are you going to do? It's not going to work. So this is a wealthy person saying this, a billionaire. He said it may not happen in his lifetime. He was in his 80s now. Now he's early 90s. But it's possibly happened in your lifetime, told me. Think about that. So now you have a Trump. So Trump is just a symptom of something that is much, much larger. But he's doing what the very wealthy love. He promised that. Tax cuts to that, right? So he's going to be tax cuts. How are you going to pay for government, right? How are you going to pay? It means you're going to cut from everything else, all the social spending. So you're creating literally people that eventually may have nothing to lose. Please click on the GoFundMe link, and obviously you'll see more details about this case, about how this journalism has transpired. So far, only Black Star News has covered this case. And that goes back and ties to what this wealthy individual was telling me might happen to this country. Trump only has 4 years, but if they can keep this type of policy or system ongoing, then you know what? It will more than likely end up the way this very wealthy person I know suggested might happen in this country. Because at some point, people will have nothing to lose. People are already so desperate already. Think about that. And you're talking about continuing cuts and continuing tax breaks for the very wealthy. So that's only one half of it. The other half is this. I really sincerely don't believe that the alternative is the Democratic Party either, the way it is right now. And that's part of the reason why Trump won. Because people are really disaffected, right? The Democratic Party is also essentially a party of the wealthy elite.
Facts.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, they have better policies than the Republicans, but how significantly different, right? Still, the people that are in the leadership, the people that get elected, are people that are beholden to corporate money. You see? As we speak today, I don't think that party that can really appeal to the working class and let the working class change things in this country, that party doesn't exist yet. And it's so interesting that I can actually use that to make a comparison to Africa as well. And that's why I learn so much every time I listen to Rodney. I learn something new. So there's another lecture, Crisis in the Periphery, Africa and the Caribbean. And this is one part that you say. It says, even the most progressive parties and leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, like Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, who was a socialist. He said, at the same time, these were also, and their parties were parties of the elite. They're parties of the elite. They may be very progressive, but at the end of the day, they are parties of the elite. And what did he mean by that? He said the only change that can be done effectively if the party leadership are the working people as well.
You know what, man? I've been saying this quote lately. I hope no one steals it, right? But black people, they don't want the system to change. They just want their position in the system to change.
And we can't have that.
And I think that's where people aren't understanding what's going on.
And we can't have that, you see? And that's where you need enlightened. But here's what I've discovered. People want to learn. People don't want to change because they may not know better, right? They may think, and they do think, that the only alternative is Republican, Democrat. Republican, Democrat. At one point, the African National Congress did not exist in South Africa, right? It's in power today. It still needs a lot of work to do, and I hope young people keep changing it, but we don't have official, formal apartheid like we had. So at some point, Africans said, no, we have to change this, right? So the alternative could not be, there were two white parties. One, basically, most of the leadership members were Dutch descendants, right? They call them Afrikaners. And the other was the party of English descendants, right? So they created the African National Congress. They created the Pan-Africanist Congress. So it's Robert Sobukwe. And, who deserves the whole future episode, we should discuss Sobukwe. But in time, it kept growing, right? Because it was the party of the majority population in South Africa. It is the party in power. Now, it needs to get its act together, or it's going to invite the white parties to come back into power, right? So I give this to suggest that something similar needs to happen in this country. But every time you bring up the idea, people say, oh, no, it takes a lot of money, these two parties, the Democrats, Republicans, are monopolies. They get all their donations. Well, if you're only thinking in the short term, if you're thinking, oh, we want to win elections in 4 years, well, no, it won't take 4 years. But who's to say within the third election cycle in 12 years' time? That's not a very long time in historical terms, right? But so long as you don't have a party that working class can identify with. Rodney went to Guyana and they're creating the Working Family Alliance, right? Because the choice in Guyana was the party that supposedly represented the interests of African Guyanese, Indian Guyanese. And Rodney said, no, you can't be appealing on this racial appeal alone. It makes it too easy. You're not addressing the issues that need to be done. And if you speak to people about the issues, then it doesn't matter whether they're Indian Guyanese or African Guyanese. They're going to come to this party. And that's exactly what was happening in Guyana. You see? And that's why Rodney was eliminated by Forbes Brunner. So I'm saying this suggests that this country needs a party that represents, working people, whose leadership, working people, membership, working people. You can't tell me that you're part of working people because, okay, let's say you're a Democrat, you're part of working people, and you're suggesting to me that, oh, I'm going to build this higher wall across the border as Trump is going to do too. Why should a working person vote for you then? That's your base. But you're locked in that scenario because you see the polls, right? You see the polls, and the immigration and border thing is a very important thing to voters. So you want to say something that will attract votes because you don't have core principles for your party, right? You can't have a party based on polling. Let's see what the poll is suggesting and then, tailor our policy towards the polls. No, So that's why I say in that respect, they're very similar in that respect, right? And, of course, they're also kind of protected because they don't use the direct, racist, explicit racist appeal like the Republicans do. But substantially, they cannot deliver for the working class. Working class party. People say, oh, it's going to take a long time. It may take a few election cycles. Yes. But ultimately, what are you going to do? The alternative is to keep saying, okay, which one of these two is the lesser evil? Which one is going to hurt us as African people in this country less? That's not enough. That's not how, that's a very low bar to set. You see?
I've been having a lot of conversations with people about the future of Africa and what's going on there. And I hear two stories. I hear a lot of progress going on in Africa, but I also see a lot of things that are still the same, right? What's going on with African leadership?
Unfortunately, we don't have good African leadership. And when I say good African leadership, my standard, I measure by Thomas Sankara, the late Thomas Sankara, what he was trying to do in Burkina Faso, which is exactly why he was killed. He wanted to do the same thing that Patrice Lumumba tried to do in Congo, when Congo won its independence in 1960 from Belgium. And what Lumumba wanted to do, at that time, the main resource was copper. And there was uranium too, which primarily was going to the United States. He said, now that we're independent, we have to change these contracts. Belgium can't be the one benefiting. What's the meaning of independence? And that essentially is why they got rid of him, number one. Number two, he was talking about contributing to the struggle to liberate what was then Rhodesia from white rule, South Africa from white rule, Mozambique, Angola. And with Congo's resources, they said, no, we can't have this guy even start walking independently. So 3 months after independence, overthrown, they put that monster Mobutu, who ran that country to the ground for 37 years. And they killed Lumumba in January 1961. Who helped Lumumba as best as he could at that time was Kwame Nkrumah, because Ghana had won its independence early in 1957. And what did Nkrumah say when they won independence? He said the independence of Ghana is meaningless without the total independence of all the other African countries, so that we can form a United States of Africa. That's the only way we'll be able to protect our mineral wealth. If they wanted it before we were independent and they took it by any means necessary, including colonization, what makes you think they won't do the same thing, even after we have paper independence? So the only way to do it, a United States of Africa, with a united government, a Pan-African government, for the whole continent. And then, of course, you can have your regional governments, right? But more importantly, a national army. Think about that. An African army for the whole continent. Then we can protect our resources. We can use it to industrialize, just like all of them are using our resources, taking it overseas, industrializing, manufacturing, and then selling the products back to us at exponentially higher prices. So he really helped Lumumba. Otherwise, maybe he would have lasted a month, but it still didn't help because Ghana was still a young, developing country as well. So he was targeted as well, right, Nkrumah? And that's why he was overthrown in 1966 in a coup in which the CIA was involved. But you have Thomas Sankara, comes to power in 1983, inspired by the memory and the legacy of Lumumba and of Kwame Nkrumah. Burkina Faso does not really have much in terms of mineral resources.
It's landlocked too.
It's landlocked too. But the most important resource really are the people. Think about it, it's the people. So you don't have the kind of gold, diamond, copper, uranium, cobalt, coltan that Congo has. But now you have one of the best leaders ever produced in Africa. Says, let's stop this dependency, physical dependency and mental dependency. Change the name of the country from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, the land of the uprighteous people. And they started doing for themselves, right? Including producing their own food. He said, if you have to import your food, how can you say you're independent? We've been growing food for such a long time, for centuries, before the Europeans came. Now, why are we importing food? Within 3 years, they were food self-sufficient, right? Education, healthcare, fighting deforestation. The people started taking control of their own destiny.
And I'm not going to lie to you. When I found out about Thomas Sankara, it was hard for me to process because this man was so far ahead of his time. Especially what struck me most is his approach to women's rights.
Yes.
And the environment.
Absolutely.
That's the part that really,
think about it.
I couldn't process.
We're talking 1983, you see? And the man read, he loved reading. When he had discussions with journalists, he would discuss the books he read. He would ask them what they're reading, And this is a young leader produced in Africa. So it's completely false and propaganda when they say Africans cannot produce leaders of that caliber. But leaders of that caliber are eliminated. And it does two things. Number one, it scares the leadership in other African countries. So who wants to be killed like that?
Just fall in line.
Fall in line. They cannot all that be incompetent. So there's a lack of courage, you see? And they're sustained, they become wealthy. So they do the role that the European colonial governors used to do. Now it's good. Now you got a black person doing it, an African person. You can't complain about colonialism anymore, when in fact colonialism does exist. It's called neocolonialism. You do the same practice that you used to do in the past. You force them to sell their raw materials, whether it's agricultural, whether it's mineral resources, natural resources, for cheap, and then buy the stuff that you make with their own minerals at exponentially higher prices. The people that used to manage those plantations were European governors, right? Now you have Africans, black people. So who can you blame? Okay. So imperialism and Europe now just sits back and laughs. So you see, what did we tell you? We weren't that bad. Look at what the Africans themselves are doing. So those presidents, prime ministers, they are the wrong representation of Africa and Africans. In fact, they work for the benefit of imperialism and for Europe and for the United States, but not for Africa. That's why increasingly when I speak to young people, I encourage them. If your leader in your country is not similar to Thomas Sankara, that should be your measure. If they're not similar to Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, do whatever you can to get rid of that. And they have a right to. Why should young Africans be drowning in the Mediterranean, trying to cross to go to Europe so they can sweep the streets? They can clean their toilets or work in kitchen. Why? They do it because they're so desperate and they want to send money back to their family. But they don't need to even do that. If their countries had leaders like Thomas Sankara, using the resources, getting the right price that they should be getting for those resources, and then using some of the resources to industrialize, why would they have to go to Europe? Why would they have to go to South America and then go through the Darien Gap? And hundreds die every year trying to make it to the southern border here in the United States. That's become like another big tendency now to try to get to the U.S., to the southern border in this country. Why? Why? Because they don't have the right leadership who are doing the right things. So I tell them, why take the risk of drowning in the Mediterranean or getting killed in the Darien Gap? If you want to take a risk in changing the leadership in your own country. That's actually even much less risky, I think. If you all organize, you saw what happened in Kenya. The young people in June 2024, they started protesting because the government wanted to increase the taxes.
Crazy, by the way.
Crazy. People are already overtaxed. Why did the government want to increase the tax? So they could pay off the loan, the interest on the loan to the IMF and the World Bank. Think about that. And they said enough is enough. We barely have enough to eat, and you want to impose more taxes on food, on fuel, on stuff that we can't avoid not buying. You see what I'm saying? So you got them trapped. They have to buy those things to survive. So you increase taxes on those. They have no choice but to pay it. Who's going to survive without food, without fuel? You see? So they protested. But I'm saying that as indication because the government had to back off. You see? Sadly, dozens were killed. I mean, the estimates range from 30 to 50 people killed. Yeah. Many injured, many kidnapped, but they organize on social media. They should take that approach all over the continent and remove the bad leaders, have leaders like Thomas Sankara.
I have another question for you, right? One of the things I observed while I was in Ghana is that it seems like my affiliation to my tribe trumps my affiliation to be an African. Is that one of the big issues with a deterrence from the unity in Africa across tribes within a country and within other countries?
Okay, so here's what is the best proof about the fallacy of that whole thing. It's real, but it's a false narrative. It's a false concept. And I can easily, disprove it. Because when you come here to the United States, like I come here, and I meet other Africans, right, from the continent. In the beginning, I don't even know which country they're from, right? But there's that automatic affinity as African people, you see? Because now we're in a neutral setting. So it shows and it proves that when you're in those countries, somebody is using that false narrative for their own benefit. And normally it's politicians, right? It's politicians that highlight that, try to point on these false differences. There are no differences. They grow the same type of food, with minor variation because it depends on the climate in that particular region where you come from in that country, right? So they keep emphasizing and magnifying those alleged superficial differences. And of course, if you keep reinforcing it, again and again and again, it has effect.
And listening to you, I don't. They know what they're doing, but I don't think they know the magnitude of what they're doing. Because what I notice with leaders is that they don't think long term; they just think short term in their situation. So they're all right. I have to get elected. I have to maintain power. So I'm creating this issue amongst my population that's going to go on long after that I leave.
Without a doubt.
But I don't care.
Don't care because I got elected. I got reelected.
Yeah.
I got reelected a couple of times using that.
Dirty game.
It's just like using the race card in this country as well. It's similar to that, but it's very effective. Your race is so superficial, but at the same time so potent and so powerful. It's so. And I don't know if I ever mentioned this incident to you. Years ago, I'm walking in New York, right? A bitterly cold day, freezing. And I had my hand in my pocket, and I didn't have gloves that day. So I run into this freezing, shivering guy, looked like a homeless guy, a European-American. And he asked me for some spare change. And I paused, actually stopped. And then something told me I had a long walk ahead of me. I realized I didn't have gloves on. As soon as I take my hand out, it's gone. You can't put it back in. It's already freezing. So I said, I'm sorry. It was because of the fear of taking my hand out. So I kept walking. And then what does he do? He hits me with the N-word. Think about that. Here is a wretched, trembling guy on the street who just asked me for spare change. And because I didn't or couldn't give it to him, he felt he still had that Europeanness to use the N-word as a weapon against me. So it just tells you how preposterous it is, But it's potent, I can't pretend that I wasn't angry when I heard that. In fact, I turned around and I said, you know what? I'm heading to my post office to check my mail. If I come back and you're still here, who knows what might happen, Think about that. And then the worst thing, if I'd come back, he was gone, by the way. I came back, he was still there. Let's assume something had happened. And a cop car is coming by with European cops. Who's the one who's going to get locked up, because of the race thing, Look at what race does in South Africa. Look at what race does in Guyana. Think about that, in a country like Guyana. And that's why I love, there's this lecture on YouTube by Walter Rodney.
The great Walter Rodney.
Yes, the great Walter Rodney. Race, is it race and class in Guyanese politics? And he explains how superficial it is, but how the European colonial plantation owners played it up, between Indian Guyanese and African Guyanese. And that legacy still causes trouble even today in the 21st century.
They don't leave out Trinidad, too.
Think about the same thing. And he talked about that. He said it's the same thing in Trinidad. Rodney said that. He said the same thing in Suriname, But the lecture breaks it down and explains to you how nonsensical and superficial it is. The same thing with so-called tribe in Africa. It's completely hopeless, useless, does not benefit anyone except the individuals, such as politicians, who highlight it for political gains, while the country doesn't benefit,
I want to talk about the brilliance that's in Africa, right? I was born 84, so I saw the whole feed the children thing, right? And I have to give credit where credit's due. They did a great job of creating an idea about Africa, right? What people don't understand, though, is that the brilliance is there, but I think people in the West don't understand the lack of resources that are there. And they take the lack of resources and lack of opportunity for lack of brilliance. Can you speak on that?
Yeah. Well, it's a contradiction. Actually, the people that run the Western countries, the people in the know, they know, right? They know it, absolutely. Most of the major companies, like the top Fortune, whether 100 or 500 companies, in the United States, they have a presence in Africa.
And utilizing that brilliance.
Of course they do. So they know. But the propaganda of demonizing Africa, right, is very effective. Because first of all, it does something which to me is the most destructive. There's a disconnect between Africans in diaspora, aka Caribbean Africans, African Americans, right? Malcolm spoke about this in the 1960s. He says, who would want to associate with the Africa that they present to us,
Facts.
right? Jungles, cannibals, savages, as Malcolm said. While you and I want nothing to do with Africa, let alone anybody refer to us as African. And there's a YouTube clip, I think it's called, You Can't Hate the Roots of a Tree Without Hating Yourself, right? Because had Malcolm lived and that connection that he was trying to really build taken root, I think it would have helped push progress toward a United States of Africa. And it can be done within a short time. In 1960, the per capita income per head of Ghana was double that of China. Let's think about that. I think China's, was about $80 per head. This is using World Bank figures. And anybody can go and look it up. Ghana's, I believe, was almost 190, right? And within that time frame, China is today a superpower, right? Because China uses its resources and its talent, to build wealth and prosperity in China, right? So it can be done. It can be done. And the other proof and evidence, you can find well-trained, well-educated Africans from the continent all over the industrialized world at top-level positions, right? So we need to create an environment on the continent where people of that caliber are willing to contribute their talent. But it's very difficult when you have leaders that have allowed the continent to be locked almost in the same position of the 1960s. So if you look at the level of industrialization from the 1960s, it's not changed. In fact, it's gotten worse. Industrialization is normally a measure of how income is increasing because now you have higher skill level jobs, higher pay level jobs, right? But that has been going down in African countries. And our population has been going up. So you have economic retrogression. You never used to see these scenes of young Africans drowning across the Mediterranean. You never did. Not in the 60s, not in the 70s, not even in the 80s, which is evidence at how dire the situation is. But at the same time, it's superficial because all the mineral wealth is still there. You see, it's still there. But if you don't have the leadership that is going to do the right thing in terms of how to organize society, like they tried in Burkina Faso, things will continue to get worse on a superficial level. And I keep saying superficial because some people, because of the propaganda, have that concept that this is the permanent African condition. It's always going to be this way. And another way to disprove that this is completely false, this propaganda narrative is a very recent phenomenon. If you look at the long history, right? Ancient Kemet, right? AKA ancient Egypt. That was an African civilization by Africans like this, right? So how could people create that level of civilization and then descend to the Africa that is projected to the world today, unless it is superficial, which it is. And for people who want a very good analysis, not very short, is an interview, which is also on YouTube. Just put interview with Cheikh Anta Diop, Antadiop. That interview by Listerveld, Middleton, was just brilliant. Just 58 minutes. And after that, if it does not transform your mind, I shouldn't even put it that way. It will transform your mind and understanding of Africa. You see? So you cannot be inferior to other people when you created that civilization, number one. Number two, and here's what, it's almost comical that many people don't know this. Every other so-called race was sprung from Africans. You see? When people that are now called Africans, they were not Africans, of course, but they were inhabitants of the continent now known as Africans, migrated to other parts of the world through about 30 to 40,000 years of adaptation to the new environment and the climate. They took on different features to be in sync with those new environments and the new temperatures and climates. And that's how we end up having, today we have, so-called African, we have Europeans, you have Asians, originally all from the same. And that's why genetically, we are basically all the same, you see? But the propaganda has taken such a hold that even many Africans, sadly, believe it, thinking that Europeans are inherently somehow superior to Africans, intellectually, morally, and all that. Because also they see the cities they've built in Europe and in America, in the United States. They see the roads, the highways, the bridges, and all that. Well, guess what? If you plunder, right, and you have somebody working, a whole people working for centuries without compensation, you would build that city as well. And another good proof and evidence that it can be done even in Africa, South Africa, where Europeans subjugated Africans to the same type of enslavement that was done in the so-called New World. And that's why if you go to South Africa, you see that those cities and highways and bridges comparable to any that you would find in Europe, built off the sweat and blood of Africans, you see?
Free labor is the quickest way to grow your economy, right?
There you go. So we just need to connect all these concepts together and be able to educate, empowering education for our youth, and then let them do the rest. Even in this country, a lot of the transformation occurred because of young people in the 1960s who were intellectually liberated, and then they took to the streets and they had some impact,
It's in Belgium, right? I don't think this gentleman is spoken of enough. For those unaware, could you break down who King Leopold is and the destruction that this man caused during his time,
Right.
and still exists to this day?
Right. All right. So King Leopold of the Belgians and his agent, Henry Morton Stanley, who was his, how they had those so-called explorers, right? Those were basically scouts going out to map, African regions so they can know where the wealth is located, which they then used later on when they had the formal partition of the continent at the Berlin Conference from November 1884 to February 1885. So Leopold worked with Stanley to map out, the Congo region, the Congo Basin, and realize how much natural wealth, that location had. And then Leopold declared that to be his personal, estate, the Congo Free Estate. There was nothing free about the Congo. It was a genocidal regime that he set up. And many people probably have watched the film Lumumba by Peck, the Haitian filmmaker. And that really, in the beginning, it shows the scenes of Africans with severed limbs or holding the hands or feet of other Africans. That was his incentive staff. The big commodity at the time was rubber. So if they didn't produce enough rubber, chop off and then display them, the ones with severed limbs, to the others to scare them into producing, rubber and ivory, the big thing. It was so genocidal that it's estimated that as many as 10 million Africans may have perished. And then it was so horrific that the Belgian government said, we have to do something about this. It was so embarrassing even to fellow European colonials who were similarly plundering and killing.
That's wild when someone's doing the same thing you're doing
Think about that.
and saying like this is out of any.
So you're putting us to shame. Other other colonial assassins are telling this to Leopold. So the Belgian government said, okay, we have to stop this embarrassment. So they took the possession away from King Leopold. And did they do the right thing and say the Congolese, you manage your own affairs? No. Their solution was to make it an official colony of the Belgian government, right? And of course, this lasted until 1960 when Patrice Lumumba and his party won the first democratic elections in the Congo. But given all that wealth that had been accumulating all these years, they're used to it now. They never wanted to let go. And
I'm glad you brought that up. I think people
Paid the
don't
price.
understand that aspect of when they have these conversations on surface level. They say, well, why doesn't... They are not giving up.
no,
There's so many businesses and economies tied to getting this natural resource. You can't just cut
Absolutely.
it off.
no, it can't. They can't cut it off. And what I like about Rodney the most, Walter Rodney, is that it keeps reminding us that it's an interconnected global system. And he talks about location. So African countries, he spoke about Caribbean countries, are located what he called the periphery and at a marginalized position. He calls it international division of labor. So they will never allow you to industrialize, because if you industrialize, you are basically taking income away from European, American, and today Chinese companies too. Because then where are they going to sell?
You won't have to buy the finished product.
Exactly. Who's going to buy it? Where are they going to sell it to? The best place to sell it is in a location where you're not even permitting them to produce the same things. So now they compete amongst themselves. The margins are going to be smaller, right? But they still make their margins by volume, right? And then they come to your market and they own your market as well. Think about that. And that's why two things actually that essentially killed Sankara. We said, produce what you consume and consume what you produce. Think about that. He's telling them basically, stop buying from them. Make your own, right? And then that will cut off the dependency, because when you can't make your own, what do you end up doing? You borrow. That's why all of them are indebted to the World Bank and IMF to the tunes of billions of dollars. That's connected with what I just spoke about earlier about Kenya, increasing taxes so we can go pay the IMF and the World Bank. Which takes me to the second point I was going to make about Thomas Sankara. At the 1987 Organizational African Unity meeting, and people can go on YouTube and watch this. It's in French, but it has English subtitles. He said, first he repeated that, consume what you produce what you consume. So for example, what I'm wearing, there's not a single thread from Europe. Yeah. Textile, the stitching, everything, Burkina Faso. Yeah. You see? And that's creating jobs for his people, right there, whole industry, right? But then he said something which was the bullseye. He said, the debt that we owe, we can't pay it. And that's the money we need to build our own countries and to feed our people. And some of the debt they loaned to corrupt governments that they knew were corrupt, but that was benefiting them. some of the debt we inherited at so-called independence. How can you get independent from a European country and you have a debt? Because they say, oh, by the way, when we were running the country as a colony, we took up some debt. And now you got to pay for that.
Cold as ice.
Think about that. He said, we need to renounce it, but we need to do it collectively. If I do it alone, I won't be alive to attend next year's Organization of African Unity meeting. Now it's the African Union. At that time it was called the OAU. That was July 1987. October 1987, brutally killed by an agent of imperialism, his so-called comrade, Blaise Compaoré, who now lives in exile in Ivory Coast, whose leader at that time was another Western puppet, French puppet, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, who actually worked together with Compaoré on behalf of French imperialism to get rid of Thomas Sankara.
Hey, do you think that King Leopold's reign is the most brutal time in African history?
Oh, absolutely. But all of it collectively, because, and I would not say, well, and you know, I shouldn't even be comparing relative. All of that was destructive. His was much more pronounced because, you know, more associated with one person. But what they did collectively, even going back to enslavement, even before colonialism, because what Rodney also points out, which is not sufficiently spoken about, is not only the removal of Africans, physical removal during enslavement. And by the way, removal of the most talented class, right? Agriculture was a very highly prized skill, right? So some of these best agriculturalists were the ones that were removed. And that's why the so-called New World benefited from the agricultural skills, and productivity of food went up.
We lost a skill set.
We lost that skill set.
And they benefit from the skill.
Absolutely. And number one. Number two, the wars that now is generated, right? The wars to capture other Africans for this market of enslavement. And once that war started, now you have abandoned farmland. Nobody's producing anymore. The economies are disrupted. So people are dying. Not only the ones that are taken overseas, not only the ones that die along the Middle Passage, but the ones who remained on the continent are now dying because of the wars that have now been generated, the lack of production, the disrupted economies. So Rodney discusses how for one whole century, Africa was the only continent where the population did not go up. The population went up every other place. And now, of course, is one of the fastest growing in terms of population because we don't have that kind of destruction of enslavement. We have a different type of destruction today. It doesn't reach that level. So it just tells you how bad that level must have been.
Yeah, and listen to you talk. I know it's not on that level today, but it seems like the same game because brain drain's a serious thing.
Yeah.
And the brightest minds are providing their talents to foreign countries.
Right. I agree with you.
More. So it's like it's the same game, but a different hustle.
Yeah, a different hustle. The only slightly redeeming aspect is that the money that they now send back to the continent is actually more than what they used to get in so-called foreign aid, you see? Right. But that's still not enough because money sustains you. You need skilled labor, skilled type of work. And that can only come from industrialization. And, you know, maybe we don't have to wait and start at a massive level. We can't say, let's wait till we have a United States of Africa, and then we'll be able to do all these things. You can do intermediate engagement at the same level. We have Africans people of African descent, whatever they want to call themselves, right? They need to start getting involved in industrial enterprises on the African continent. Go after markets that are already established, the so-called low-hanging fruit. The chocolate industry, for example, it's a multi-billion-dollar empire. African countries get minuscule, when in fact, all the cocoa is grown in either Ivory Coast, Ghana, Nigeria, maybe 2 other countries, all from the continent. And yet they sell it in these huge sacks, literally for pennies, so that when you go to any store, fine chocolate store, and then you look at the back, made in Belgium, made in Switzerland, made in whatever, countries that do not have a single cocoa crop. How is that possible? So this is where we can intervene. African descendants with resources, let's get together and make those plans. Go to the producers and work out with them. Work with the governments, build factories, and produce the chocolate in those countries and sell it as finished product, chocolate, and make a huge part of the billions of dollars that already exist. So you're not creating a new industry. You're just coming at a higher level and joining it. You're coming to sit on the table, not waiting for the crumbs to drop beneath the table when they cannot produce chocolate without cocoa, and you have all the cocoa. You see? Let me give one other example. Now that the electric car is becoming a big thing and it will keep growing, they need the batteries, right? And they need the batteries using resources like cobalt. And between Congo and Zambia, they literally have like 70% of this commodity. So why should you be under the table? You should be saying, okay, we are willing to sell at this rate. At the same time, in addition to just money, we want to build the factories to produce the batteries right here. So we are selling the batteries and making money out of that. Stage 1. Stage 2, we want to produce the electric cars from right here, Congo and Zambia. Now you're creating jobs, not only for Congo and Zambia, but from Africans. And let Africans come from all over the continent, right? Because it's going to be a big industry. So now you're industrializing, on the one hand, from a major level, right, with the electric car thing. But on the other hand, at a level that you don't need very massive intervention. You need conscious Africans, African descendants, to get together, come up with their companies, and then go and engage with those governments in those few countries that produce cocoa. And you can use that for any other commodities as an example,
Within the last 30 years, right? Is this the hardest period to earn an income?
It's the hardest, but at the same time, it also has potential. Why does it have potential? Because of new media, because of social media. It now provides you with the capability to be self-employed. You see? And I think that's the direction that many of these economies are taking anyway, so that you can actually realize your talent. And there are many people that are really, benefiting from that. But at the same time, that's a small margin compared to the amount of resources and capital that is out there. So when you have public spending being decimated, of course that's going to impact employment, particularly to our communities where historically we've been starved of capital, right? Even capital to start our own businesses, you see? So definitely, we are the ones that are hurt the most. And that is why we need some of us that knew how to leverage this new media platforms, social media, and how to monetize that. We need to teach that skill and impart it to younger people. Young people are very good at that as well. They're very good at how to operate the social media. So now we need to guide them in how to accumulate capital and build that capital into other investments. So, for example, why can't we have young people who are making some money from their social media platforms team up with older people who know the opportunity that is available in African countries and take some of that capital and get involved in the kind of businesses that I just outlined? Because right now, there's a very interesting documentary about Zambia. I'm trying to remember the title. And it shows how people are coming from China and going to Zambia and setting up small-scale manufacturing in Zambia, owned by Chinese. Why can't we, as Africans in diaspora, be involved in those type of enterprises? So eventually, we will be economically independent of the capital that now gives us all these conditions that essentially keeps us in servitude. So yes, if you're looking at the traditional 9 to 5, right, it's not good. But perhaps we should get away from the traditional 9 to 5 anyway, because we've been dependent on the traditional 9 to 5 for such a long time in a position that we are not the ones who actually control the 9 to 5. If the 9 to 5 is controlled by African people, African descendants, because those are our companies, enterprises that we created, that's a different matter.
And I observe, man. I think that we look at institutions within our time and space as absolute, and it's hard for us to grasp the concept that things kind of run their course. And I feel we're in the time now where a lot of things that were the norm have run their course.
Yeah, it's interesting that you put it that way. And that's a hard
pill to swallow.
It is very hard to swallow, but
it is like it is what it
look,
is.
Okay, look at it this way. At one point, nobody believed that slavery would end. Not the so-called masters. They had a good thing. In their wildest imaginations, they could never believe that structure would change. You get captives from the continent, bring them, put them on the auction block, you select the best, put them to work. You're accumulating wealth. How can you beat that? Industrialization, right? Now the capitalists are the enemies of those plantation owners. You are holding potential laborers whom we can exploit. You're holding them in prison. Those plantations are prisons. You see? So it's capital now that is wrecking the slavery model of production. It wasn't that Europeans woke up one day in England and said, oh, I feel so bad about what we've been doing to these African people. We got to abolish slavery. No. They were working together with the capitalists who were saying, no, we can't have some nut sitting there on a plantation, lording over hundreds of these people who could be working in factories and then using the salary to buy the manufacturers. That became the better model. And that went on then with colonization, where you have some aspects of slavery, but not holding people on plantations. The plantations are larger now. It's a whole country, like Uganda, like Kenya, so they can actually move around. There's a different type of plantation, but they're still producing cheap labor, resources, and buying your products. So that change, at some point, the contradiction, you could no longer sustain that either, right? So now you allowed some of the Africans to become the role that used to be, reserved for European governors. Now you make them presidents, prime ministers, but the system, keep going. We are at another inflection point. The system has outlived its usefulness. And this is why I sincerely believe we at another inflection point for young people to take control of their destiny, take leadership in all those African countries. And they have a different type of mindset now, right? They actually know and think they can do because they engage with other young people on social media. They see what young people are doing in the industrialized countries, and they know there's nothing special about them. In fact, some of them work together on spaces that they've created on social media. A person in Africa, a person in Europe, a person in the United States, a person in Asia, right? If you're already doing it on social media, put it in practice physically on the ground as well. That's why, and it will happen anyway, because Africa, as you know, is the youngest continent in the world. It just means the people that should be, and they're the majority population within their countries. Young people are the majority population, right? But yet, if you look at the leaders, they're not the youth.
70, 80.
Exactly, right? So that's holding back the potential. They're holding back the natural leadership, but you can only do it for so much. You could keep colonialism contained only for so much time, then eventually Africans said enough is enough. The young people will transform Africa. I believe so. They will take the leadership and we'll see remarkable transformation over the next 10, 15 years. Within a very short time, African countries can really become wealthy, and the image of impoverished Africa will change. It can be done. All they need to do is just a couple of things. Stop selling your valuable resources for cheap. Just stop that. So that's immediate more income. Start manufacturing within your countries instead of importing. That's immediate income. And that's going to translate to something. This indebtedness, you won't need the money from the World Bank and IMF anymore. That is additional income right there. And then now you're trading amongst yourselves within Africa. That's additional income. Right now, Africa is giving foreign aid to Europe, to the United States, to China. But obviously, it's disguised foreign aid. It's not like they're cutting a check, like European countries say, oh, I'm going to help Uganda or Kenya. We just gave them $100 million, $20 million, blah, blah, blah. So they brag about that propaganda and they, hold up the paper check and say, But they actually are getting a lot more from those countries by buying their minerals for cheap. If I come and you have resources here, something that's worth $1,000 and I buy it for $1, $10,000, I buy it for $100, who is really giving aid to whom, you see?
And another destructive aspect about these deals that come with aid or loans is lowering the trade barriers. Like I saw that especially in Jamaica,
Yeah.
But I'm not sure. I think it was the IMF loan they took
Yeah.
in the 90s, but they had to start. They had to start allowing certain goods to be imported
Yeah.
that were being grown in the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's what they call it. It used to be called structural adjustment or just conditionalities.
Conditionalities.
Right. Those are the most destructive thing. First of all, they say you need free enterprise, right? No restrictions. Free enterprise, do you even have that in the United States? You know, it's amazing that people,
Restrictions on business.
of course,
For those unaware.
people live in this country. They buy that mantra of, oh, this is the freest country, free enterprise, capitalism, invisible hand. It's all nonsense. When the economy almost collapsed, 2008, the Great Recession, what happened?
Cutting checks, right?
Cutting checks left and right, the federal government, right? You know, trillions of dollars, right? Helping the banks,
It's pretty wild, ain't it?
you know, helping the car industry, which would have collapsed, helping everybody except the man on the street, because they said they were too big to fail. But then when they come to Jamaica or they go to an African country, they say, we'll give you the money on condition that you have absolute free enterprise. You sell off your electric utility. Now in some countries, you sell off your airport, like in Uganda, literally, you know, every new money that they have that comes from exports, you know, China, like has a lien on that, you know, gets a cut of that to repay off, you know, the airport, you know. So literally China essentially owns the airport, right? Cut off healthcare. You have to make people pay healthcare, right? So countries that used to have free healthcare, now you have people dying of diseases like malaria because they go there. And, you know, there are very many sad stories. People can research online. You'll find stories like pregnant women coming to a hospital being denied entrance because they can't pay. Mother and child dying outside the hospital, or child surviving, mother dying while delivery, you know. People die in hospitals, the body not released to the family until the family pays. The hospital is just, you know, cut fuel subsidies, right? Cut food subsidies, right? Those are the conditions for the loans. Those are the loans that Sankara was saying we have to renounce. And they're so locked up in the system that it's like an addiction, right? You need the loans. In many cases, they even need the loans to operate the governments, right? Because they're not producing. The economy is not expanding, you know.
I saw Michael, I believe it was interview with Michael Manley, and he was saying, you know, after you take the loan, that's when you really had a rope around your neck, you know.
No, absolutely. And so there's a lecture by Samir Amin. What's the lecture? Africa's Industrialization Challenge. The late Samir Amin, he was an Egyptian economist. And he also spoke about those loans and the conditions, you know, that, for example, some of the industries that are located in African countries, you can have industries without industrialization. What does that mean? It means the company belongs to some foreign enterprise, right? So the loans are essentially to expand capitalism in these countries, right? And the kind of companies that come there, they may set up operation, but you don't own. They're there because they want to take advantage of the cheap labor
Tax.
that you provide, the tax break that they get, and then consumers for their products. You see? So what was Samir Amin saying? So we need to find alternative sources of capital, because you still need capital. Without capital, you can't build those factories. So even if you wanted to use your own resources, right, to industrialize, you still need capital. And if you go to World Bank and IMF, no. They won't allow you to use that to industrialize. They'll say no, because there are already cheaper products being manufactured in the United States, in Europe. Why don't you just import from those countries, right? So we're saying we need to look at countries like Brazil. Brazil was really generating a lot of capital at that time. And even today, Brazil has some huge banks, right, with billions of dollars in capitalization. We need to look at China. China has, multi-billion-dollar banks as well. We need to look at sources of capital that are not going to give you the same conditions that the World Bank and IMF dictate to these African countries. And as a result, that's why now you have the BRICS organization. And this includes, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa initially. That's why the initial BRICS came from, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, BRICS. And now it's expanded to include more countries. So they're hoping that they're going to use this model to generate their own capital that is separate from World Bank and absolutely, and allow these countries to industrialize using capital from BRICS. But so long as they're dependent from capital from the World Bank, IMF, they will never be able to industrialize because, as I said in the beginning, why would these institutions controlled primarily by the United States want other parts of the world to industrialize, right? And sell products that would take away income from their own corporations. That's like suicidal for them, right? They benefit from the current condition that exists in Africa, Caribbean, and other parts of the world that are not yet industrialized. Their own capital that is separate from World Bank and absolutely, and allow these countries to industrialize using capital from BRICS. But so long as they're dependent from capital from the World Bank, IMF, they will never be able to industrialize because, as I said in the beginning, why would these institutions controlled primarily by the United States want other parts of the world to industrialize, right? And sell products that would take away income from their own corporations. That's like suicidal for them, right? They benefit from the current condition that exists in Africa, Caribbean, and other parts of the world that are not yet industrialized.